Hey, it's Brian here with another exciting episode of the Confederate Hat Hour. I've got my Confederate hat, so I'm going to read some Confederate things to you. This week's episode has to do with this meme.
So it says Alabama passed a law protecting all Confederate monuments from being torn down, and it asks at the bottom, do you support the rule? And there's, I guess, a Confederate monument there in Alabama. It's got the stars and bars on the left. I can't tell quite what that thing is over on the right. Could be the stainless banner. Well, apparently Alabama is mighty proud of this thing, and this goes around the internet, and apparently a lot of people want to say yes, they support the rule.
And my feeling is we shouldn't keep those things up unless they've got some audio playing from inside them. So if you want to have something up there to honor the Confederacy, you need to be making sure that people know what the Confederacy was. And the only way to do that is by having everything that the Confederate leaders ever wrote being said out loud. That way the passerby can't just kind of skip the contextualizing plaque, and you don't need a professor of history standing there to give people a basic lesson. You can just let people hear what, in this case, the Alabamans had to say for themselves when they chose to secede. So, amazingly, a lot of people who are Southern partisans and neo-Confederates have not bothered to even read the Southern Secession documents, and that's like an American patriot who has never bothered to read the Declaration of Independence. And these things are a great way of figuring out what the Confederate states were thinking, in just the same way that if you want to know what the American Revolution was fought over, the Declaration of Independence will not tell you the whole truth, but it'll certainly tell you an important part of it. So here we go. Alabama, January 11, 1861. I'm going to read you the whole thing with just a little bit of commentary in it. This is an ordinance to dissolve the union between the state of Alabama and the other states united under the compact styled the Constitution of the United States of America. Whereas the election of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin to the offices of President and Vice President of the United States of America by a sectional party, that is the Republican Party, avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions. Every time that anybody in the Old South referred to domestic institutions, they meant slavery. There's no other institution that's remotely relevant here. So avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions and to the peace and security of the people of the state of Alabama. And you'll notice that there's no threat to the peace or security of the people of Alabama except by way of, interfering with the, domestic institution, which is to say slavery. Avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions and to the peace and security of the people of the state of Alabama, preceded by many and dangerous infractions of the Constitution of the United States by many of the states and people of the northern section, all of which have to do with the refusal to enforce the fugitive slave law. So this election is a political wrong of so insulting and menacing a character as to justify the people of the state of Alabama in the adoption of prompt and decided measures for their future peace and security. Therefore, be it declared and ordained by the people of the state of Alabama in convention assembled that the state of Alabama now withdraws and is hereby withdrawn from the Union known as the United States of America, and henceforth ceases to be one of said United States, and is, and of right ought to be, that's phrasing from the Declaration of Independence, a sovereign and independent state. Section 2, be it further declared and ordained by the people of the state of Alabama in convention assembled that all powers over the territory of said state and over the people thereof heretofore delegated to the government of the United States of America and they are hereby withdrawn from said government and are hereby resumed and vested in the people of the state of Alabama. And as it is the desire and purpose of the people of Alabama to meet the slaveholding states of the South, who may approve such purpose, in order to frame a provisional as well as permanent government upon the principles of the Constitution of the United States, be it resolved by the people of Alabama in convention assembled that the people of the states of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi be and are hereby invited to meet the people of the state of Alabama by their delegates in convention on the 4th day of February AD 1861 at the city of Montgomery in the state of Alabama for the purpose of consulting with each other as to the most effectual mode of securing concerted and harmonious action in whatever measures may be deemed most desirable for our common peace and security. Be it further resolved that the president of this convention be and is hereby further instructed to transmit forthwith a copy of the foregoing preamble, ordinance, and resolutions to the governors of the several states named in said resolutions. Obviously, a bunch of lawyers wrote this. done by the people of the state of Alabama in convention assembled at Montgomery on this, the 11th day of January, 1861. So which states did they think that they were going to be seceding with? The slaveholding states of the South, and then they list all of the states in which slavery was legal. They didn't say the tariff-paying states of the South, they said the slaveholding states of the South. The only justification offered in this document for secession is that the northern states were going to be fussing somehow or other with slavery. Now, I know that Lincoln was not an abolitionist, and you know that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. But the good people of Alabama apparently didn't know that, or else they thought that the Republican Party was going to be aggressing against slavery in some other way than by trying to abolish it. They said it. They didn't have the motives that I wish they had. They didn't have the motives that you wish they had. They had the motives that they actually had. And the way to figure out what those were is not to theorize. It's not to ask, would you do that kind of a thing? Because of course you wouldn't. It's to ask, what did they say? Well, they said it. But that is not the first thing that they said about it. Of course, that secession document was the result of an awful lot of fussing and hemming and hawing and meeting and so forth beforehand. So as early as February of 1860, they were beginning to get seriously worried about the results of the election that was not going to happen until November. So you can look up the Alabama Secession Convention. The entire thing is digitized. It's 484 pages, and it's a collection that was made by the government of Alabama in 1861. So it is not some kind of postmodern liberal cultural Marxist interpretation. This is what the Alabamans wanted us to know that they had said. So on the 24th day of February 1860, the Alabama legislature adopted the following joint resolutions with great unanimity, there being but 2 dissenting voices. Whereas anti-slavery agitation persistently continued in the non-slaveholding states of this union for more than a third of a century, marked at every stage of its progress by contempt for the obligations of law and the sanctity of compacts, evincing a deadly hostility to the rights and institutions of the Southern people, and a settled purpose to effect their overthrow, the institutions, even by the subversion of the Constitution and to the hazard of violence and bloodshed, and whereas a sectional party calling itself Republican, committed alike by its own acts and antecedents, and the public avowals and secret machinations of its leaders to the execution of these atrocious designs, has acquired the ascendancy in nearly every northern state, and hopes by success in the following presidential election to seize the government itself, and whereas to permit such seizure by those whose unmistakable aim is to pervert its whole machinery to the destruction of a portion of its members, would be an act of suicidal folly and madness almost without a parallel in history, and whereas the General Assembly of Alabama, representing a people loyally devoted to the Union and the Constitution, but scorning the Union which fanaticism would erect upon its ruins, deem it their solemn duty to provide in advance the means by which they may escape such peril and dishonor, and devise new securities for perpetuating the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. Therefore, be it resolved that upon the happening of the contingency contemplated in the foregoing preamble, namely, the election of a president advocating the principles and action of the party of the northern states calling itself the Republican Party, it shall be the duty of the governor, and he is hereby required forthwith to issue his proclamations calling upon the qualified voters of the state to assemble on Monday, not more than 40 days after the date of said proclamation, at the several places of voting in their respective counties to elect delegates to a convention of the state. The rest of it is just legalese. All right, so the volume continues with the historian saying the following resolutions adopted at the same session will serve still further to show the spirit that animated the legislature of Alabama. So joint resolutions of the General Assembly of Alabama in response to the resolutions of South Carolina. So South Carolina had been concerned with a similar issue, of course. First, be it resolved that the state of Alabama, fully concurring with the state of South Carolina in affirming the right of any state to secede from the Confederacy, whenever in her own judgment such a step is demanded by the honor, interest, and safety of her people, is not unmindful of the fact that the assaults upon the institution of slavery and upon the rights and equality of the Southern states, unceasingly continued with increasing violence and in new and more alarming forms, may constrain her to a reluctant but early exercise of that invaluable right. So they've mentioned slavery, but what are these other assaults upon the rights and equality of the Southern states? Right? I can't assault your rights without actually doing something to you. Right? So what other action other than attacks on slavery were the northern states committing, and there's nothing mentioned. Now, after the election had happened, the governor of Alabama and Mr. Moore fulfilled the obligation that had been placed on him back in February. So he wrote this on November 14, 1860, just a couple of days after the election. He wrote, "Gentlemen, I received your letter of the 12th asking for my construction of the joint resolutions of our last legislature," that is the thing that I read a couple minutes ago, "for the call of the convention of the people of the state. You particularly desire to know when I consider myself authorized to issue my proclamation for the call of a convention, whether upon the election of electors by the people of the several states, or when said electors cast their votes for the president." So there's a discussion there about whether he needs to wait for the Electoral College to vote, or whether he can go ahead and act only once the popular vote is in. I fully agree with you that these are questions of deep interest to the people of the state, and having, after mature deliberation, determined to put my course in regard to them, and not considering it inconsistent with my public duty to communicate that determination to you, with leave to publish it, I unhesitatingly do so. The intense interest and feeling which pervade the public mind make it not only proper, but my duty. After stating a long list of aggressions in the preamble to the joint resolutions referred to, the first resolution, okay, did you notice a long list of aggressions? Because all of them, everything that's been mentioned so far as a northern aggression has had to do with slavery. So after stating a long list of aggressions in the preamble to the joint resolutions, the first resolution provides that upon the happening of the contingency, etc., the governor is going to have to call somebody. So that's what he's doing at this point. He then describes how the Electoral College works and says that he will not be calling this convention until after the Electoral College has met. My proclamation will not therefore be issued until that vote is cast on the 5th day of December next. I regret that this delay must occur, as the circumstances which surround us might make prompt and decided action necessary. There can be no doubt that a large majority of the electoral vote will be given to Mr. Lincoln, and in views of the certainty of his election, I've determined to issue my proclamation immediately after that vote is cast. I shall appoint Monday, the 24th day of December next, for the election of delegates to the convention. The convention will meet on Monday, the 7th day of January next. The day for the election of delegates has been designated in advance of the issuance of the proclamation in order that the minds of the people may at once be directed to the subject, and that the several counties may have ample time to select candidates to represent them. Each voter of the state should immediately consider the importance of the vote he's to cast. Constitutional rights, personal security, and the honor of the state are all involved. He must decide on the 24th September the great and vital question of submission to an abolition administration or of secession from the Union. It's not a tariff administration. It's not a taxation administration. It's an abolition administration. This will be a grave and momentous issue for the decision of the people. To decide it correctly, they should understand all the facts and circumstances of the case before them. It may not be improper or unprofitable for me to recite a few of them. Who is Mr. Lincoln, whose election is now beyond question? He is the head of a great sectional party calling itself Republican, a party whose leading object is the destruction of the institution of slavery as it exists in the slaveholding states. I don't know what would be more straightforward than that. So have that coming out of the statutes in Alabama. That would be historically interesting. Their most distinguished leaders in and out of Congress have publicly and boldly proclaimed this to be their intention and unalterable determination. Their newspapers are filled with similar declarations. Are they in earnest? Let their past acts speak for them. So here's the history of the Republican Party according to Alabama secessionists. Nearly every one of the non-slaveholding states have been for years under the control of the black Republicans. A large majority of these states have nullified the fugitive slave law and have successfully resisted its execution. That is, they would not help people kidnap black people and send them south. They've enacted penal statutes punishing by fine and imprisonment in the penitentiary persons who may pursue and arrest fugitive slaves in said state. They have by law, under heavy penalties, prohibited any person from aiding the owner to arrest his fugitive slave, and have denied us the use of their prisons to secure our slaves until they can be removed from the state. They've robbed the South of slaves worth millions of dollars and have rendered utterly ineffectual the only law passed by Congress to protect this species of property. They've invaded the state of Virginia, arming her slaves with deadly weapons, murdered her citizens, and seized the United States Armory at Harper's Ferry. So this is not a reference to like First Manassas. This is a John Brown reference. That really creeped them out. They've sent emissaries into the state of Texas who burnt many towns and furnished the slaves with deadly poison for the purpose of destroying their owners. That didn't happen. In the summer of 1860, it was a very hot, very dry summer, amazingly hot, dry winds. There was a new brand of match on the marketplace that lit really easily. And so Dallas and a couple of other towns, the stores in them actually just lit fire one day. And everybody basically understood that this was a weird commercial accident until some fire-eaten editors, newspaper editors, got wind of it, and they said, well, instead of 2 towns basically burnt down and one with some damage, we're going to have dozens of towns burnt down. So people from different towns would meet one another and say, oh, I'm sorry, your town burnt down. And they'd each be saying it to the other, and each one would be saying, what are you talking about? My town is completely fine. There were no poisons ever found. So there were dozens of people, some missionaries, some black people that were hanged, but this just hadn't happened, right? It was fiction. But anyway, so allegedly, the Republicans have sent emissaries into the state of Texas who burnt many towns, furnished the slaves with deadly poison. All these things have been affected either by the unconstitutional legislation of free states or by combinations of individuals. These facts prove that they are not only in earnest and intent upon accomplishing their wicked purposes, but have done all that local legislation and individual efforts could effect. Knowing that their efforts could only be partially successful without the aid of the federal government, they for years have struggled to get control of the legislative and executive departments thereof. They've now succeeded by large majorities in all the non-slaveholding states except New Jersey and perhaps California and Oregon in electing Mr. Lincoln, who's pledged to carry out the principles of the party that elected him. The course of events show clearly that this party will, in a short time, have a majority in both branches of Congress. It will then be in their power to change the complexion of the Supreme Court so as to make it harmonize with Congress and the President. When that party get possession of all the departments of government, with the purse and the sword, he must be blind indeed who does not see that slavery will be abolished in the District of Columbia, in the dockyards and arsenals, and wherever the federal government has jurisdiction. It will be excluded from the territories, and other free states will in hot haste be admitted into the Union until they have a majority to alter the Constitution. Then slavery will be abolished by law in the states, and the irrepressible conflict will end, for we are notified that it shall never cease until, quote, the foot of the slave shall cease to tread the soil of the United States. I don't know where the quote's from. The state of society that must exist in the southern states, with 4 millions of free Negroes and their increase turned loose upon them, I will not discuss. It is too horrible to contemplate. It will be excluded from the territories, and other free states will in hot haste be admitted into the Union until they have a majority to alter the Constitution. Right? So there's an agreement. The Republican plan is not to abolish slavery until they can amend the Constitution. There's an agreement here that everybody knows there was no way that the federal government could abolish slavery in the states in which it existed, which means that if someone were to offer, for instance, a constitutional amendment guaranteeing that slavery would not be abolished within the states, it wouldn't make any actual difference since everybody already agreed to that. That amendment was offered in late 1860, early 1861, called the Corwin Amendment. Nobody bothered going with it because it was a dead letter. If the Constitution already made it so that you couldn't forbid slavery within the states in which it already existed, adding an amendment saying that it can't will not change anything. So the plan, according to Alabama, was for the Republicans to eventually amend the Constitution. So then slavery would be abolished by law in the states, and the irrepressible conflict will end, for we're notified that it shall never cease until the foot of the slave shall cease to tread the soil of the United States. I don't know where the quote is from. The state of society that must exist in the southern states, with 4 millions of free Negroes and their increase turned loose upon them, I will not discuss. It is too horrible to contemplate. So whenever you read about Southern soldiers saying that they were trying to defend the sanctity of their homes, that's what they were talking about. They didn't go to war because they wanted to keep the Yankees away. They wanted to keep the Yankees away because they were at war. The fear that they had in their own homes was not of Yankees. The fear that they had in their own home was of their slaves being liberated and turning on them. I've only noticed such of the acts of the Republican Party as I deem necessary to show that they're in earnest and determined to carry out their publicly avowed intentions, and to show that their success has been such as should not fail to create the deepest concern for the honor and safety of the southern states. Now, in view of the past and our prospects for the future, what ought we to do? What do wisdom and prudence dictate? What do honor and safety require at our hands? I know that the answer that I shall give to these questions may subject me to severe criticism by those who do not view these matters as I do, but feeling conscious of the correctness of my conclusions and the purity of my motives, I will not shrink from responsibilities in the emergency which presents itself. It would be criminal, quote, in those entrusted with state sovereignty, that is, the government, not to speak out and warn the people of the encroachments that have been made and are about to be made upon them, with the consequences that must follow. In full view, and I trust, a just appreciation of all my obligations and responsibilities officially and personally to my God, my state, and the federal government, I solemnly declare it to be my opinion that the only hope of future security for Alabama and the other slaveholding states is secession from the Union. I deplore the necessity for coming to such a conclusion. It has been forced upon me and those who agree with me by a wicked and perverse party fatally bent upon the destruction of an institution vital to the southern states, a party whose constitutional rights we have never disturbed and who should be our friends, yet they hate us without a cause. Should Alabama secede from the Union, as I think she ought, the responsibility in the eyes of all just men will not rest upon her, but upon those who have driven her in self-defense to assume that position. The Southerners, the secessionists, and all of their defenders have a really frustrating tendency to pretend that the South didn't actually do anything, that the Yankees elected Lincoln, and somehow that just made the secession happen. Or to say that the secession can't have been problematic because it was legal. Whether it's legal or not, you can do a legal thing for a terribly immoral reason. If I were to drink 24 cans of Bud every night, we would not say that that's a good idea just because I can do it. And if I were to drink 24 cans of Bud every night because I'd had a romantic disaster of some kind, it would be really weird to say something like, should I drink 24 cans of Bud tonight, as I probably should. The responsibility in the eyes of all just men will not rest upon me, but upon she who has driven me in, spiritual self-defense to assume this position. Right? It's a desperate attempt to evade responsibility for your actions. He continues, has Alabama the right peacefully to withdraw from the Union without subjecting herself to any rightful authority of the federal government to coerce her into the Union? Of her right to do so, I have no doubt. She is a sovereign state and retains every right and power not delegated to the federal government in the written Constitution. The government has no powers except such as are delegated in the Constitution or such as are necessary to carry these powers into execution. The federal government was established for the protection and not for destruction or injury of constitutional rights. A sovereign state has a right to judge of the wrongs or injuries that may be done her and to determine upon the mode and measure of redress. The Black Republican Party has for years continued to make aggressions upon the slaveholding states under the forms of law and in every manner of fanaticism could devise, and have now gained strength and position which threaten not only the destruction of the institution of slavery, but must degrade and ruin the slaveholding states if not resisted. And there's nothing else about how the ruination is going to happen other than by ending slavery. May not these states turn aside from the impending danger without criminality? If they have not this right, then we are the slaves of our worst enemies. Gosh, that would be terrible. The wise man foreseeth the evil and turneth aside. A wise state should do no less. If Alabama should withdraw from the Union, she would not be guilty of treason, even if a sovereign state could commit treason. The Constitution says treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. The federal government has the right to use its military power, quote, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So that is the power that Lincoln appealed to when he moved armies south. He was planning on executing the laws of the Union, and obviously he considered that the secession of the states was an insurrection. If a state withdraws from the Union, the federal government has no power under the Constitution to use the military force against her, for there's no law to enforce the submission of a sovereign state, nor would such a withdrawal be either an insurrection or an invasion. We should remember that Alabama must act and decide the great question of resistance or submission for herself. No other state has the right or power to decide for her. She may and should consult with the other slaveholding states to secure concert of action, but still she must decide the question for herself and cooperate afterwards. The contemplated convention will not be the place for the timid or the rash. It should be composed of men of wisdom and experience, men who have the capacity to determine what the honor of the state and the security of her people demand, and patriotism and moral courage sufficient to carry out the dictates of their honest judgments. What will the intelligent and patriotic people of Alabama do in the impending crisis? Judging of the future by the past, I believe they will prove themselves equal to the present or any future emergency, and will never consent to affiliate with or submit to be governed by a party who entertains the most deadly hostility toward them and their institution of slavery. They're loyal and true to the Union, but never will consent to remain degraded members of it. So the governor called his convention, and then they met, and what did they set about doing? Well, here's the resolution of resistance with which they began. So as soon as they'd figured out the speaking order, who was going to preside, they had a prayer. They decided people weren't going to be applauding, so I imagined everybody was doing jazz hands. So they had this resolution of resistance. The first debate in the convention arose upon the following resolutions offered by Mr. Whatley. I don't know who that is. Whereas the only bond of union between the several states is the Constitution of the United States, and whereas that Constitution has been violated both by the government of the United States and by a majority of the northern states in their separate legislative action, denying to the people of the southern states their constitutional rights, and whereas a sectional party known as the Black Republican Party has in the recent election elected Abraham Lincoln to the office of president and Hannibal Hamlin to the office of vice president of the United States upon the avowed principle that the Constitution of the United States does not recognize property in slaves, and that the government should prevent its extension into the common territories of the United States, and that the power of the government should be so exercised that slavery in time should be exterminated. Therefore, be it resolved by the people of Alabama in solemn constitution assembled, that these acts and designs constitute such a violation of the compact between the several states as absolves the people of Alabama from all obligation to continue to support a government of the United States to be administered upon such principles, and that the people of Alabama will not submit to be parties to the inauguration and administration of Abraham Lincoln as president and Hannibal Hamlin as vice president of the United States. And it just goes on like that, right? Hundreds of pages of we need to resist the Black Republicans because they have not adhered to the fugitive slave law and they don't want us to take slaves into the territories, and eventually they want to abolish slavery. No other justification is mentioned. So if Alabama wants to keep up its Confederate statues, maybe it should do that, but only if it's having these kinds of things read out loud from inside all of them forever, so that everybody knows what Alabama is honoring.